The sun slowly sank behind the mountains of Arizona, painting the evening sky in a blend of brilliant orange and somber indigo. The last light of dusk spilled through the dusty window of a lone wooden house on the outskirts of town, casting faded beams across the peeling paint that time had long since weathered. Inside the silent house, Jessica Reynolds sat motionless in an old armchair, her arms resting limply by her sides. Her empty gaze drifted toward the landscape beyond the glass, but didn't seem to focus on anything. At 37, it was hard to believe she had once been a fearless soldier who spent nearly a decade on the front lines, facing dangers only those who fought in brutal wars could ever truly understand. Now, she was just a gaunt, hollow figure, self-imprisoned in this house for the past 2 years since leaving the service. The little house wasn't cold, but the air always felt heavy, as if every trace of life had been drained from it. Cracks ran like veins through the weathered walls, scars left by time, mirroring the invisible wounds Jessica carried deep inside. She lived alone. No friends, no neighbors came by. They'd long since grown used to her refusing help, shutting people out. To them, she was just an odd woman, a former soldier broken by something they couldn't understand. But no one knew that inside Jessica raged a storm that never stilled. A war she faced, alone, every single day. The nights were her silent enemies. When darkness fell and everything was still, the memories came, sharp and brutal, like shrapnel tearing through her mind. The deafening blasts echoed in her skull. Scenes of bombs dropping, comrades falling, desperate screams for help. They played on a loop with no end in sight. She woke from nightmares, soaked in sweat, hands clenched tight, as if she were still gripping her rifle, ready to fire. Even the simplest sounds, the window rattling in the wind, a distant truck engine, a dog barking at night, could make her flinch, heart pounding as if it might explode. More than once, she found herself on the floor, back pressed to the wall, breathing hard, trying to quiet the panic with trembling hands and the fragile will to stay alive. Just one more time. Jessica's loneliness was like a room without windows, without light, without a way out. Each day was a dull repetition of the last. She no longer registered the passage of time. She only knew that when the sky brightened, she had survived another day. And when night came, she braced for another battle with memories that wouldn't fade. The only person who kept coming through that closed door was Emily, her gentle but fiercely determined older sister. Emily wasn't discouraged by Jessica's cold silences or the way she shook her head each time therapy was suggested. She came often, carrying a paper bag of home-cooked meals, placing them on the kitchen counter, and sitting in the chair across from Jessica, telling her stories about town. About old Mr. Hank arguing with his late wife in his imagination, or the kids from the west side learning to skateboard in the blazing summer heat. Emily knew that if she ever stopped showing up, Jessica might one day have no reason to get out of bed at all. One June afternoon, as sunlight quietly spilled across the wooden floor, Emily sighed, placed a warm cup of tea in Jessica's hands, and sat beside her. Her voice was soft but serious. "Jess, you need someone with you. Someone you can trust. Maybe a four-legged friend?" Jessica said nothing. Her eyes narrowed as she stared out at the yard, where the wooden gate had long since stayed closed. Emily pressed on, the worry breaking through her calm tone. "You told me about Rex. How he kept you sane. How he kept you alive. Jess, I think it's time you tried again." The name stopped Jessica cold. Her heart clenched as if gripped by an unseen hand. Rex, the loyal war dog who had fought by her side through every brutal mission. He had been her eyes, her ears, her lifeline when she was close to breaking. But Rex had been taken from her after their last return to base. The military had retired him, placing him in a special discharge program for wounded service dogs. After that, there were no messages, no trace. Jessica never had the chance to find him again. She had always told herself that Rex was the one part of her life she had no choice but to let go. But today, under Emily's gentle yet unyielding push, a small flicker of light crept into the darkness Jessica had sealed herself in. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to try, to take one step beyond the cold shell she had built around herself, to give herself, and Rex, a chance to find each other again. Jessica said nothing, but something shifted in her eyes. And so the journey toward healing, one Jessica had never dared to imagine, began. That afternoon, after Emily left, the house slipped back into its familiar silence. But this time, it wasn't empty. Jessica still sat in the armchair near the window, but something inside her had moved, something restless, like Emily's words still lingered in the air, quietly urging her toward what she had avoided for 2 long years. As the last light of day faded over the worn wooden floor, Jessica stood slowly and walked to the corner of the room. There, an old wooden chest sat locked with a rusted iron latch. Inside was everything from her past she no longer wanted to face. Relics, memories, wounds no doctor could ever heal. She crouched down, her thin fingers brushing over the lock, hesitating for a moment before turning the key. A dry click echoed in the quiet as the chest creaked open. Dust rose in the dim light, and at once the smells rushed back. Old leather, cold metal, the scent of war that had filled her lungs for so many years. She dug through the jumbled contents. A dented helmet with the faded silver insignia of her Special Ops unit. A pair of torn tactical gloves she had worn on endless night marches, and a battered leather notebook scrawled with strategies, survival tips, and messy handwriting from comrades, most of whom were long gone. But her hands froze on a small photo, one she knew by heart, down to its faint scratches, even though she hadn't looked at it in years. It was her, in camo fatigues, face sun-darkened but eyes sharp, kneeling beside a powerful German shepherd. Rex, his black and tan coat gleaming, ears pricked, eyes sharp and loyal, stared toward the camera, his chest broad and proud. A true soldier. The photo had been taken on their last day before a mission no one thought they'd survive. And it was Rex who had saved her that day, when the bomb exploded in front of them, blowing apart everything, including the last of Jessica's faith in people and the world. Among the scattered keepsakes, Jessica pulled out a medal, the Medal of Valor, awarded to Rex for his extraordinary bravery in combat. Memories she thought had faded slammed back with such force she had to close her eyes, clutching the cold metal tight in her calloused hand. Rex had been more than a comrade. He had been the only one who understood her darkest moments, when everything else had fallen apart. With Rex, she had believed she could survive anything, even war. But after his injury, he was forced to retire, separated from her, and transferred to an adoption program she knew nothing about. And just like that, her life emptied. She still remembered the day they parted, when Rex was loaded onto a military truck. He had turned his head one last time, his gaze carving an unspoken promise into her heart. Then the truck rolled away, taking her only hope with it. She searched for him, desperately, hopelessly, following paper trails and dead ends. Eventually she gave up, locked herself away with the chest, convincing herself the past was better buried. But now, the cold weight of the medal in her hand was a reminder. Some promises don't fade. Some bonds can't be cut, no matter the time or distance. Jessica set the photo and the medal on the table, staring at them as if hoping that somewhere Rex was remembering her too. Her heart was heavy, but a faint spark stirred inside. In the shadowed corner of the room lay a pile of old letters and military reports. On top was a file from a small animal rescue center up north, one Emily had quietly sent to her. Jessica exhaled slowly, her eyes still on Rex's photo, and stood. She knew that this moment was what kept her from breaking completely. One last chance to reclaim what she had lost. This time, as her hand closed the chest, it wasn't to lock the memories away. It was to prepare for a new journey to find Rex and to find herself. When Jessica closed the wooden chest, Her thin fingers brushed lightly across its rough surface. She sat there for a long time, frozen, as if letting go would cause the past to spill out and consume her all over again. Outside, the night wind began to weave through the rows of pine trees, whistling softly, blending with the sound of familiar footsteps approaching on the gravel path leading up to the porch. Emily had returned, earlier than usual, bringing with her the warmth and endless patience Jessica never quite understood how her sister managed to hold on to. The door creaked open. Emily stepped inside, her eyes sweeping past the now shut chest before resting on Jessica's face, where ash-gray eyes still drifted in quiet sorrow. She didn't need to ask. Emily knew Jessica had just reopened a door she had kept locked for 2 long years, and that was why Emily decided she couldn't wait any longer. She placed her bag on the kitchen table and took out 2 containers of still warm food, and a cup of herbal tea she knew might help Jessica sleep, though her sister always refused. Emily dragged the wooden chair back with a scrape and sat down, folding her arms across her chest. Her gaze was gentle but unyielding. When she spoke, her voice wasn't loud, wasn't harsh, but there was something in her tone that made Jessica realize this wasn't just a casual visit. "Jess," Emily began, her steady blue eyes holding Jessica's hollow stare. "I know you're tired. I know you feel like there's no reason to keep going. But you can't stay here, locked inside days that lead nowhere." Jessica remained silent, her fingers absently tracing the edges of the metal lying on the table, moving out of habit, saying nothing in response. It was the same thing she always did when she didn't want to listen or didn't know what to say. But Emily wasn't deterred. She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower but gaining a weight Jessica hadn't heard before. "I read the file from the rescue center up north," Emily said, her eyes fixed on Jessica's. "A shepherd was brought in about 3 weeks ago, a dog that used to be military." Those words cut through the hardened shell Jessica had built around herself. She lifted her head, and for the first time in months, her gaze wavered. Her voice was dry when she spoke. "And you think he can replace Rex?" The question was sharp, like a blade slicing through the air already thick with tension. Emily didn't flinch. She had been waiting for that reaction. She exhaled slowly and took her sister's calloused hands worn from sleepless nights and the weight of memories no one could carry alone. "No one can replace Rex, Jess," Emily said, her voice steady with sincerity even Jessica couldn't ignore. "But you need a reason to keep going. Maybe another dog, not to fill that space, but to remind you that you can still care, still protect, still love." Jessica closed her eyes, pulling her hand away, then stood and paced the small room. She stopped by the window, staring out at the dark yard where tree shadows blurred under silver moonlight. Part of her wanted to resist, to insist she was too tired to rescue or hold on to anything ever again. She was afraid of losing something, someone, all over again. But another part, fragile but persistent, was quietly fanning the last embers still burning in her heart. Finally, after a silence that seemed to stretch on forever, Jessica turned around. Her eyes weren't entirely hollow now. There was confusion there and fear, but also the smallest flicker of hope. "How long do you think he'll be there?" she asked. Her voice was as soft as breath, but to Emily, it was stronger than any promise Jessica had ever made before. Emily squeezed her sister's hand gently and smiled. This time, a real smile. "Tomorrow morning, I'll drive you up there," she said, leaving no room for argument. "And maybe he's waiting for you too, just like Rex always waited for you to come back from your missions." Jessica bowed her head, but didn't reply. She closed her eyes and saw Rex's gaze again. The last time they'd looked at each other through the window of that military truck. That look had haunted her every single day since. And now, if there was even a chance, no matter how small, she knew she couldn't let it pass. For the first time in 2 years, Jessica agreed to step out of her darkness. Even if it was just one unsteady step, she was ready to try. The next morning, before the sun had broken through the thin mist covering the red dirt road out of town, Jessica was already sitting in the passenger seat of Emily's old pickup truck. Her hands were clenched tightly together, knuckles pale from tension. Her eyes stared far into the distance through the dusty window, trying to avoid the reality drawing closer with each passing mile. They said nothing during the hours-long drive. Only the sound of tires crunching over gravel and the wind slipping through the cracked window filled the space between them. But beneath the silence, Jessica could feel her heart pounding too fast. It wasn't excitement. It was the tug-of-war between hope and fear, between fragile anticipation and the dread of seeing it all disappear in an instant. The rescue shelter came into view as they rounded a small bend, hidden beneath towering eucalyptus trees. It was a simple place, with no grand sign, just a rusted wire fence and a crooked wooden board that read, in faded white paint, Hope Haven Rescue Shelter. Emily pulled the truck to a stop at the gate. She gripped the steering wheel tightly before turning to Jessica with a look of quiet encouragement, though her worry was hard to hide. Jessica took a deep breath. Her hands were still trembling as she placed them on her lap. Then she pushed open the door and stepped out. Her military boots struck the dry earth with a firm sound, like a drumbeat reminding her that there's no turning back. As they crossed the yard, a young woman appeared from the small wooden house at the far end. She was tall and lean, her brown hair tied back neatly. On her t-shirt was the shelter's logo, and pinned beneath it, a name tag, Lisa Carter. It wasn't until she came closer that Jessica recognized her faintly. Emily had mentioned her the night before. Lisa was Michael's younger sister. Michael, her old teammate and a combat vet turned veterinarian. Lisa approached, her gaze warm but cautious, something Jessica picked up on immediately. It was the look of someone who had spent too much time with broken creatures, animals and people alike, and knew that even a careless word or gesture could shatter the last of their trust. "Ms. Reynolds," Lisa greeted her, her voice calm and steady. "I'm Lisa, the manager here. Emily told me about you, and I think we have a friend you might want to meet." Jessica gave a small nod. She couldn't find her voice. Her throat was too dry to speak. She simply followed Lisa past rows of chain-link kennels under the trees, where dogs, most of them abandoned or rescued from abuse, lay curled up or barked hoarsely, eyes wary or worn. They stopped at a separate row of larger enclosures, set apart from the noisy parts of the shelter, tucked under deep shade. Lisa gave Jessica one last questioning glance, as if to make sure she was ready. When Jessica nodded again, Lisa slid the latch and motioned her inside. The air was thick with the scent of disinfectant and rusted metal. Jessica clenched her fists tighter, nails biting into her palms just to stay grounded. Every step forward felt like walking straight toward an old wound, one that hadn't healed, one she was afraid would tear open again. They stopped at the largest kennel at the farthest end. Inside, a large German shepherd lay curled up, his fur rough and matted in places. His chest rose and fell with slow, labored breaths. The ears that had once stood so tall now drooped. The sharp, proud light that had once filled his eyes was gone, replaced by something dull and distant, as if all hope had long been strangled out of him. But Jessica knew him. She didn't need Lisa to say another word. It was Rex. Her throat tightened, and a flood of memories hit her hard, like a crashing wave. The times they'd crossed mined fields and deadly terrain together. The nights she had slept beside him on cold battlefields, his warmth the only thing keeping her tied to life. And now he was lying there, silent and spent, looking at her with no recognition at all. Just emptiness. The emptiness of someone betrayed too many times. Lisa knelt beside her. Her voice was gentle but grave. "We found him at another holding facility, in bad shape. We don't know everything that happened. It looks like someone adopted him but couldn't handle it, and abandoned him again." She hesitated, then added softly, "He doesn't trust anyone anymore." Jessica stood still, her hand resting lightly on the cold steel of the cage. Her palm shook as she felt the wall between them, thick and invisible. she whispered, voice raw and broken. "Rex, it's me, Jess." But the dog didn't move. He didn't lift his head. He just closed his eyes, as if he no longer cared who came or went. That was the moment Jessica understood. The deepest wound wasn't in Rex's body. It was in his soul. And if she walked away now, they might both be lost for good. But right there, in the heavy silence of that secluded room, Jessica felt something stir inside her. A fragile, stubborn flame refusing to go out. She knew it wouldn't be easy. But maybe, just maybe, if she was patient, Rex would find his way back to the light. And maybe, so would she. Jessica stood motionless in front of the iron kennel, her hands gripping the cold steel bars so tightly that her knuckles turned white, matching the way her heart clenched painfully in her chest. She had called Rex's name, softly, as if whispering a gentle memory from the past. But all that answered her was silence. Rex lay there, his once powerful frame now gaunt. Patches of fur were rough and scarred, his eyes half closed, drained of all emotion. He didn't lift his head. His tail didn't move. There wasn't a flicker of light left in his gaze. The emptiness in Rex's eyes, if it could be called seeing at all, was cold and unfamiliar, as if Jessica had never existed in his world. Lisa stood quietly at her side, her eyes full of understanding. But she didn't interrupt. She knew this moment belonged to Jessica and the dog who had once been an inseparable part of her life. Yet, the silence only made the pounding in Jessica's chest louder, each thud sharp and painful in the hollow space inside her. Slowly, she knelt, searching through the iron bars for any sign, any small spark that Rex recognized her. But there was nothing. Nothing but emptiness. It was the same harsh emptiness as a battlefield after a bombing run, where nothing survived but a painful memory. "Rex, it's me! Jess!" Her voice was hoarse, as if it had dragged itself from lungs long unused to speaking. She had thought that if she ever found him again, Rex would rush toward her like he had back at base, his strong legs pounding the ground with purpose, his tail wagging wildly like a victory banner. But now, Rex only lay there, breathing softly, each breath long and slow, as if her presence meant no more than the countless shadows that had passed through his life since he'd been abandoned. A wave of dizziness came over her. Jessica slowly rose to her feet, releasing the bars as if the strength in her body had drained away completely. She turned and walked out of the isolation area, each step heavy and numb, as if her legs no longer obeyed her. The iron door closed behind her with a metallic clang, echoing through the space like a verdict, sealing away the fragile hope that had just begun to take root. Outside the shelter, the wind had picked up. It whipped dry dust into the air, thick and choking. Jessica leaned back against the side of the pickup truck, exhaling hard as if trying to push the pain from her chest. But the more she tried to breathe deeply, the more she felt herself sinking into an endless void. Emily stood nearby, watching quietly, offering no words, because some pain, no matter how deeply understood, could not be shared. Jessica bent forward, bracing her hands on her knees. She closed her eyes, letting the hot tears fall freely onto the dusty boots she wore. Drop by drop they fell, sharp and bitter as blood, tearing open wounds she thought had long since healed. She had survived war and endured endless nightmares, holding on to hope for this moment, the moment she and Rex might find their way back to each other. But now, all that remained was a numbing indifference, a cruel rejection that left her with nothing left to hold on to. But then, in the depths of her despair, a familiar voice echoed in Jessica's mind. Her voice, from her days in uniform, from when they first trained Rex. No one gets left behind. It was the rule she had lived by, fought for, and sworn never to betray. And now, if she gave up, who would save Rex from the darkness he was trapped in? Who would bring him back when no one else believed he could be saved? Jessica clenched her fists, digging her nails deep into her palms until the pain sharpened her focus. She lifted her head, her eyes still wet, but her gaze had changed. It was no longer the gaze of a broken woman. It was the look of a soldier who had decided to stand up after her hardest fall. "I won't give up," she whispered. Her voice was soft as the wind, but solid as a vow carved in stone. She turned and walked back toward the shelter, her steps steadier now, toward the place where Rex still lay motionless in the shadows. And this time, she knew, the road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with pain. But every step she took now was a step toward bringing Rex back, a step toward bringing them both home from a different kind of war. Not one of bullets and bombs, but of the deepest wounds a soul could carry. When Jessica returned to the isolation area, where Rex was still curled in the corner of his kennel, she felt her heartbeat settle. No longer frantic, no longer crushed by panic or hopelessness, but steady. Driven by an inner strength she thought she had lost long ago. Yet, no matter how determined she was, she knew the truth. She couldn't do this alone. It was then that Lisa, who had quietly observed from behind, placed a gentle hand on Jessica's shoulder. Her voice was cautious but kind. "Maybe you should talk to Dr. Carter." Jessica blinked. It took her a moment to recognize the name, though it stirred something familiar deep within her. Dr. Michael Carter. Not just a well-known veterinarian in this region, but her former teammate, a member of their rapid response unit years ago. He had been there with her and Rex on some of the most dangerous missions in the Middle East. A strange mixture of distance and familiarity rose inside her, as if long-forgotten pieces of her past suddenly clicked into place. Moments later, Lisa led her toward the wooden building at the center of the shelter. Jessica saw him there, bent over an exam table, tall and broad-shouldered, his posture slightly hunched in concentration. Sunlight slanted through the dusty window, highlighting the hard lines and weathered strength of his face. Michael looked up at the sound of footsteps, his deep blue eyes flashing with surprise. And then, for just a moment, relief, before his expression smoothed into the calm neutrality of a soldier who had learned long ago how to hide his emotions. "Jessica Reynolds," he said. His voice was deep, warm, and steady, like a drumbeat recalling old times. "Didn't expect to see you here." He stepped forward and held out his hand. When their rough, calloused fingers met in a firm handshake, Jessica felt the strength of someone who had stood beside her through life-or-death moments. There were no loud greetings, no rushed questions, only a familiar silence between two old warriors who understood too much to need many words. Lisa left them alone, closing the door behind her. The quiet that settled was a kind of peace only those who had known battle could truly appreciate. Michael poured her a glass of water and slid it toward her before opening the medical file on the table. On top was Rex's chart. "I examined him as soon as Lisa brought him in," Michael began, his voice even but heavy. "Rex is severely malnourished. He's lost significant muscle mass, and there's joint inflammation from old injuries that weren't properly treated. And most importantly," he paused, his eyes sharper now as they fixed on Jessica, "he's suffering from severe PTSD. It's exactly what we've seen in our teammates and in ourselves." The words hit Jessica hard, as if a rope had tightened around her throat. She swallowed, her gaze lowering to the table where her hand absently traced circles on the cold glass. "I saw it," she whispered. "His eyes, they're empty, like I'm no one to him anymore." Michael nodded slowly, his expression turning thoughtful as he pulled out an X-ray and pointed to several areas on the skeletal structure. "Rex hasn't just lost his trust in people, Jess. He's lost his trust in himself. Combat dogs are trained to have absolute faith in their handlers and their mission. When that world collapses, when they're abandoned or betrayed, they don't know how to be dogs anymore." He looked back at her, his voice softening as he saw the pain carved into her face. "But if anyone can bring him back, it's you." Jessica met his gaze, confused and hopeful all at once. She hadn't thought Michael still believed in her, especially after everything she'd left behind on the battlefield. The fear, the failures, the helplessness. "I'm not sure," she exhaled. "I'm not sure I can even bring myself back." Michael smiled faintly, something bittersweet but understanding in his expression. He laid a steady hand on her shoulder. Not intimate, but solid. An anchor she hadn't known she needed. "Start with Rex, Jess," he said, his tone slow and sure. "We all need a reason to keep going. Maybe he's yours, like you were his." He handed her another file, a treatment plan specifically designed for PTSD in working dogs. Every step was detailed. How to recognize reactions, and how to reestablish connection through gradual exposure and positive reinforcement. "It won't be easy," Michael added, his voice slipping into the firm cadence of a commander. "There'll be days when you feel like you're going nowhere. But you trained Rex to be a warrior once. Now it's time to train him to be your companion again." Jessica took the file. She flipped through it slowly, carefully, reading as if it were the briefing for a mission that meant life or death. And in a way, it was. This time. For both of them. She lifted her gaze to Michael's. Without saying a word, a silent agreement passed between them, just as it had before every dangerous op they'd ever run. "I won't give up," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in years. A promise she wouldn't break. Michael nodded, satisfied. "Lisa will take you back to Rex," he said, turning towards the door but glancing back once more. "And Jess, don't forget, we've all been lost before. What matters is who brings us home." The door closed softly behind him, leaving Jessica standing there with the file in her hands, her heart pounding like she was stepping onto a new battlefield. But this time, the enemy wasn't war or death. It was the loss of faith. And at least now she had a plan, an old teammate by her side, and above all, an old friend waiting for her to fight for them both. When Lisa led Jessica back to the isolation kennels, where Rex still lay motionless like a lifeless stone, her hand tightened around the file Michael had given her. Each page now felt like a map for a journey whose destination was still hidden in the fog. But no matter how long and difficult the road ahead, Jessica knew she couldn't turn back. Not this time. She sat quietly, waiting for hours, allowing Rex to grow accustomed to her presence. No pressure, no demands, just being there. Calm and steady. That was the first lesson Michael had emphasized. "Don't demand. Wait." And Jessica understood. With Rex, patience wasn't a choice. It was a sacred duty. 3 days later, with Michael and Lisa's quiet support, Jessica completed the special adoption procedures for Rex. She said nothing as she signed the papers, but when the pen finally touched the page, her hand trembled. She understood that this wasn't just paperwork. It was a promise. That she was ready to commit to a life already deeply scarred, ready to fight for survival one more time. For both of them. That afternoon, as Emily's old pickup truck slowly pulled away from the rescue shelter's gate, Rex lay curled up in the back, on the thick blanket Jessica had carefully spread out for him. His fur rose and fell with each breath, his gaze fixed on the sky moving past the window. He didn't look at her. There was no recognition in his eyes. Only silence, heavy, suffocating silence, like a wound that still bled beneath an old scar. Jessica gripped the steering wheel tightly, her breath catching more than once as she glanced at him through the rearview mirror. The emptiness in Rex's eyes seemed to reflect the doubt she had carried inside for years. Was there still a way back for either of them? The small wooden house where Jessica had lived in isolation for the past 2 years welcomed them with an unfamiliar warmth. Late afternoon sunlight bathed the old porch in gold. Wildflowers Emily had planted last year now bloomed bright against the dry earth. Jessica turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and stepped out. She opened the rear door of the truck and paused for a long moment before speaking softly. "We're home, Rex." She wasn't sure if the words were more for him or for herself, a test to see if the word home still had meaning. Rex didn't move. Not at first. A minute passed. Then 5. Only when Jessica stepped back, avoiding direct eye contact, not forcing anything, did Rex slowly drag his thin frame out of the truck bed. His claws scraped lightly against the gravel with each cautious step, as if the ground itself might betray him. He stopped at the porch steps, his nose lifted to sniff the unfamiliar air, ears twitching as if bracing for a threat to strike without warning. Jessica stood a few paces behind, watching, her hand unconsciously gripping her waist as though she were still wearing a combat belt. The wooden door creaked softly as she pushed it open, stepping aside to give Rex space. "This is your home now," she said, her voice little more than a quiet prayer. But Rex stayed where he was, one paw resting on the step, but unwilling, or unable, to move forward. Jessica realized then that for Rex, the doorway wasn't just an entrance to a house. It was a boundary between everything he had known and lost, and a strange new world he didn't trust. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime of stillness, Rex lowered his head, his shoulders drawing in, and he slowly stepped inside. No sound, no quick breaths, just careful, exhausted movements, as though he feared the little room might betray him, like so many others had before. Jessica had prepared the house as carefully as a battlefield medic. The corner of the living room had been cleared and softened with a plush rug, topped with a thick, warm bed she had spent hours selecting at the pet store, the one labeled premium, as if comfort could mend a shattered soul. Beside the bed were two new stainless steel bowls, one filled with cool water, the other with high-quality kibble designed for retired service dogs. She had researched for hours before buying it. Nearby, a few brand-new toys sat in a neat pile, their rubber scent still fresh. But among them was an old, chewed rubber ball, scarred and misshapen by Rex's teeth years ago. She had kept it as a relic, a reminder that even painful memories deserve to be honored. But Rex ignored it all. He stood in the middle of the room, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the front door as if still deciding whether to stay or bolt. Jessica kept her distance. Sand-aid, nothing. She remembered Michael's instructions. Don't force, just allow. So she waited, quietly letting Rex choose how to exist in this new space. Time passed slowly. The wall clock ticked evenly, like a metronome marking every beat of an invisible war. Eventually, Rex lowered himself to the wooden floor. He lay on his side but did not fully relax. His eyes remained open, his ears still pricked, alert to every sound. Like a soldier who could never afford to sleep too deeply. Jessica understood that feeling better than anyone. She had spent years lying exactly like that, in strange, hostile places, her weapon always within arm's reach. That night Jessica left the bedroom door open. A dim, warm light spilled from her room into the living area, casting a soft glow on Rex's unmoving silhouette. She didn't close herself off. She left space. An invitation, or at least a promise, that she would never force Rex past a line he wasn't ready to cross. As she lay in bed, she listened to his slow, steady breathing from the other room. It wasn't peaceful yet, but it was no longer ragged. Jessica closed her eyes. For the first time in months, she let her body relax without fear. And just before sleep took her, she whispered something nearly soundless. "We're home." Outside, the Arizona night wind still blew. But inside that little house on the edge of town, a fragile hope was taking root. And no matter how small or breakable it might be, Jessica knew she wouldn't let it go out. Not ever again. Nightfall came quickly, as if Arizona itself wanted to hide all the things that hadn't yet healed beneath the cover of darkness. In the small bedroom, Jessica lay still beneath a thin blanket. On the surface, her breathing was calm and steady, but deep inside, something churned, restless, waiting for a moment to break free. The wooden door to her room was left ajar. It was an unspoken promise she had made to herself before falling asleep. Rex could come in whenever he wanted. Or never, if he wasn't ready. But Jessica hadn't expected that the darkness wouldn't just fill the room. It would seep into her dreams, dragging her back to a place she had spent 2 long years trying to escape. In the dream, she was there again, the scorched earth beneath her boots, the air thick with smoke and dust. Helicopters thundered overhead. Bombs fell in the distance like sledgehammers pounding the ground. She was running, her rifle heavy against her shoulder, her breath ragged, her heartbeat like a war drum counting down to something inevitable. Behind her, Rex raced forward, his powerful body a shadow cutting through the smoke and fire. Then came the explosion. But it wasn't the dull boom of a bomb or the sharp crack of gunfire. It was something different. The sound of something breaking, clean, sudden, like a rope snapping under too much strain. She turned. Rex had gone down. He was lying on the ground, eyes locked on hers. Pain, fear, and something else. A desperate plea he couldn't voice. Then, silence. Jessica woke with a start. Her skin was slick with cold sweat. Her throat burned as if something had gripped it tight and wouldn't let go. She was breathing hard, shallow, and fast, chest rising and falling as if she'd just sprinted a mile. Her hands searched blindly for a weapon that wasn't there. All she found was empty air. She forced herself to sit up, her back pressed against the headboard. Her hands trembled as she rubbed her temples, trying to steady herself. Her heart refused to slow. It wasn't just a dream. It was a memory. Clear, sharp, cruel. Every detail was still raw, as if the wound had never closed. Then she heard it. A sound outside the room. Not the creak of a settling house, not the wind rattling the windows. It was soft, barely there. The faint scrape of claws on wood. Slow, careful, as if whoever was moving didn't want to set something off. Jessica turned towards the door. In the dim light from her bedside lamp, she saw him. Rex. He stood perfectly still, his body framed by the half-open door. His eyes reflected the faint glow, watching her in silence. He didn't move closer. He didn't turn away. He simply stood there and looked at her. There was no warmth in his gaze. Not yet. But Jessica felt something at that moment. A thread, thin but intact. They weren't handlers and war dogs anymore. They were two survivors, seeing in each other the same wounds, the same silent fight to keep going. Rex knew. Somehow he knew. He knew Jessica carried injuries no one could see. Injuries that never really healed. And he stood there, doing nothing, but refusing to leave. Jessica took a deep breath. She forced it to be slow, steady, grounding herself in the present. She tilted her head just slightly toward him. She didn't call his name. She didn't beckon him. She simply made herself still. Quiet. Safe. Let him decide, Michael had said. Let him choose to come closer when he's ready. And then it happened. Subtle. So slight she wasn't sure at first. His tail twitched. A small movement, maybe a reflex, maybe something more. But to Jessica, it was everything. In a room that had once felt dead, that simple flicker of life was a miracle. They stayed like that for a long time. Neither of them moved forward. Neither of them turned away. Between them was silence. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was the silence of understanding. Of two beings who knew there were no words for certain kinds of pain, and no need for them either. Jessica rested her head on her knees, arms wrapped around herself. It was how she had sat after the worst missions when there was nothing left but the exhaustion of survival. For the first time in years, she let the tears fall. She didn't hold them back. She didn't try to stop them. When she finally lifted her head, Rex was still there. His eyes had changed. No longer lost, no longer searching. Now they were steady, watching, waiting to see if she would rise again, waiting to see if she was strong enough to keep moving forward. And that was enough. Enough for her to make a promise to herself. No matter how brutal the night, she would wake up tomorrow. She would stand. She would take another step. And someday, she and Rex would both stand together outside these memories, in a place where the light no longer had to fight so hard against the dark. She whispered, "We're still alive." And in that moment, those words were enough. Enough to hold them both steady on the edge. Enough to begin again. At dawn, when pale light seeped through the thin curtains, Jessica woke with a lingering fatigue, like the heavy aftermath of a battle fought in her sleep. The house was so silent she could hear the wind slipping through the cracks in the door, and, somewhere nearby, the faint tapping of Rex's claws on the wooden floor, like an indistinct knock against time, long stagnant in their closed-off world. After that first night, when she and Rex had sat together in the dark, silent and understanding, Jessica knew the path to healing for them both was still long. But at least they had begun. The outside world, though, seemed unwilling to share her fragile hope. She realized that the very next morning when the front gate creaked sharply under the forceful push of someone outside, there was a knock at the door. Hard, curt, stripped of patience or goodwill, Jessica stood up from the chair where she had just filled Rex's bowl, her hand instinctively adjusting the belt at her waist, though no weapon hung there now. Some habits never quite left. When she opened the door, the figure in the doorway was a familiar one. Hank. He stood there, heavy boots coated in dry dust, a faded brown canvas jacket hanging stiffly on his squared shoulders. His eyes squinted, as though the early light was something he refused to tolerate. Thick, unruly brows cast deep lines across his forehead, carving a harshness into his already unwelcoming face. The air between them grew heavier. Jessica tightened her grip on the doorframe. Cautious, but not defensive. Her gaze steady, not hesitant, but not challenging either. Hank was part of this land, whether anyone liked it or not. The longest-living resident on this dirt road, he was known for his isolation, his rigid ways, and his open disdain for anyone he deemed outside the old order he still clung to. To him, people like Jessica, veterans scarred by invisible wounds he called weakness dressed as glory, were nothing but lost souls, disturbing the peace he had spent his life preserving. "Reynolds," Hank rasped, his voice low and rough like gravel crushed beneath boots. "I don't know what you brought back here, but I don't appreciate barking at 3 a.m, interrupting my sleep." He folded his arms across his chest, his squint narrowing as if assessing her worth like a worn-out relic, ready to spot any crack in her already weathered facade. Jessica stood still, palm tightening, but her voice stayed calm. Inside, though, the heat rose behind her temples. "It's just a dog," she said flatly, offering no further explanation. A deliberate act of control, holding back words she might later regret. But Hank wasn't satisfied. His gaze sharpened, like a slow blade cutting through her thin armor. "A dog? Or some war wreck you're dragging back here?" His tone dripped with scorn. His eyes darkened with a bitterness Jessica had no interest in unpacking. "We don't need trouble around here, especially not from someone dragging along something they can't control." Jessica felt a dull ache in her chest, but kept her stance straight, shoulders unbowed, even as Hank's words hit like shrapnel. They weren't unfamiliar. She'd heard them in different forms, from officers reviewing her medical file, from the pitying looks of therapists, and even from those she had once risked her life to protect. But hearing them from a neighbor she'd done nothing to harm only drove home a bitter truth. Prejudice and suspicion weren't relics of the past. They were waiting right on her doorstep. "What do you want, Hank?" Jessica asked directly. No circling, no letting emotion seep through. He needed to know she wouldn't be rattled, even if it was only a front. Hank's mouth twisted into something colder than the desert wind cutting across her porch. "I want you quiet," he said. "Keep your dog from barking at night. Keep yourself from bringing more trouble here. No one needs another vet about to lose their mind." Jessica said nothing more. She gave a brief nod. Not in agreement, but in closing. This conversation would lead nowhere worth going. She shut the door slowly, her hand resting on the knob a moment longer, feeling the cold, rough metal like a reminder. Some battles didn't need gunfire to leave scars. From the living room, she heard Rex whine, low and raw like an old wound stirred. He had heard everything. Sitting beside him, Jessica sighed, her fingers running through the coarse fur on his neck, brushing the long scar she once dressed in war zones. "We'll hold out a little longer," she whispered, soft as comfort. But in her eyes burned a light that wouldn't go out, because she knew they both needed a place to call home. And whatever Hank or anyone else thought, she wasn't giving it up. That night, Jessica left her bedroom door ajar again. But this time, she noticed Rex settling closer. He lay by the door, his breathing steady, no longer overly alert. In the moonlight cutting through the cracks, Jessica made a quiet promise. No matter the contempt of others, she would protect this home and the life inside it. That night, long after Hank's heavy footsteps had faded down the dirt road, Jessica stayed sitting beside Rex, her hand resting on his rough coat, feeling the weight of each slow breath. Each one was the measured rhythm of a soldier not ready to drop his guard, and she understood that more than anyone. But as she looked out toward the yard where Hank had stood, leaving behind his coldness like an old scar, Jessica knew she couldn't let wounds, seen or unseen, control either of their lives any longer. The next morning, Jessica woke earlier than usual. Before dawn lit the porch, she was already in the kitchen, brewing coffee and digging through an old drawer for a battered rubber ball. Its surface was chewed and scarred, covered with tiny teeth marks. It had been Rex's favorite toy back at the base. She had kept it as a reminder, a promise that if she ever found Rex again, this would be their bridge back to each other. She stepped out into the backyard, where pale light slid over the weathered fence. Rex lay nearby, on an old blanket she had spread the day before. His ears flicked at the sound of the door, but he didn't move, his golden eyes fixed on a distant horizon only he could see. Jessica knew every move toward him now was a careful battle for trust. No rushing, no faltering. She sat on the step, keeping the distance Michael had warned her to respect. Slowly, she held up the ball, turning it in her hand, listening to the faint sound of rubber against her calloused palm. Then, with no extra motion, she tossed it softly across the brittle grass. It rolled slowly, an unspoken message. You can ignore this, or you can remember something that once made you happy. Rex tilted his head, watching the ball's path. His body didn't move. Jessica wasn't surprised. She wasn't disappointed. The fact that Rex didn't turn away or leave his spot was a small victory in itself. She sat quietly for a long time, watching him without pushing. Instead, she told him a story about the time they were trapped behind enemy lines and how Rex found a way out. Her voice was steady, quiet. No highs, no dramatics, just a familiar sound slipping into the silence, like a breeze stirring old memories. Rex didn't move all morning, but his eyes stayed on the ball longer than before. Jessica noticed that first. She didn't expect miracles, just small signals, pieces to gather carefully. That afternoon, Emily stopped by with fresh food and supplies for Rex. Seeing Jessica sitting in the yard with the ball, calm and steady, Emily gave her shoulder a light squeeze. "You made progress," she whispered. Jessica didn't answer, but her gaze softened in a way Emily hadn't seen in a long time. Night came fast. Jessica left Rex in the living room, her bedroom door open again. A silent invitation. She lay in bed, watching the faint light from the hallway, listening for any small sound, any quiet movement. Then came the sound of claws on wood. Closer this time. When she sat up, she saw Rex lying nearer to her room than ever before. Still distant, but not hopelessly so. Jessica exhaled slowly into the quiet dark. It wasn't about Rex running to her. It was about him choosing to be closer today than yesterday. A small space closed between them, but for them, it was a battlefield won. As she closed her eyes, Jessica understood that sometimes a single slow step is enough to start a new journey, whether it's finding an old friend or finding yourself. That night, as Jessica closed her eyes, comforted by the small progress Rex had made, she had no idea how brief that peace would be. No more than the stillness before a storm. Outside their modest wooden house, the Arizona sky turned thick and heavy, darkening into a leaden gray that swallowed the last slivers of light from the dry land below. The wind picked up. At first it was a soft whistle slipping through the gaps in the wood, but soon it built into a relentless force, howling like the thrum of helicopter blades over a battlefield. Jessica sat up, instincts firing as if the war had never ended. And that's when she realized. Rex was no longer lying by the bedroom door. A crack of thunder shook the house, strong enough to rattle the window frames. In the split-second flash of lightning, Jessica saw the back door hanging open. Its hinges snapped as if something, or someone, had broken through it in panic. Her chest tightened with dread. She knew exactly what had happened. Rex, triggered by the deafening thunder and blinding lightning, had reverted to pure survival instinct. Run. Escape from everything he couldn't understand or trust. There was no time to think. No room for fear. Jessica grabbed her canvas jacket from the hook, shoved her feet into her old boots, and ran into the storm, straight into the sheets of rain that lashed the land like an overdue punishment. The wind whipped her face, rain stinging like tiny shards of glass. But Jessica didn't slow down. Her flashlight swung wildly in her grip, cutting thin slices of light through the downpour, across broken branches tossed around like skeletal hands, ready to drag down anyone careless enough to trip. She called Rex's name, her voice torn apart by the storm, breaking into fragile echoes lost in the chaos. But she kept running. Each breath was sharp and raw, but it was the same rhythm she knew from a dozen other nights worse than this. Then it hit her. A wave of dizziness so familiar it dragged her back into an old memory. Another night, on a high plateau choked with red dust and smoke. Flares screeched overhead. Helicopters circled. She was crawling low, blood seeping from her arm, coughing against smoke and fear. And Rex had been there, not barking, not panicking, just steady, sharp-eyed, pressed to her side like a shield. He had let her out then, one slow step at a time. Her silent guide through hell. Now it was her turn. Jessica pushed deeper into the storm, across the field, and into the soaked eucalyptus grove, her throat raw but still calling his name. "Rex, Rex, come back, it's me, Jess!" Her boots dragged heavy with mud, but she kept going. Near the dry creek bed, where dead bushes twisted in the wind, she found paw prints stamped in the wet earth. Deep. Fresh. Rex had passed through here desperate and blind with fear. A bolt of lightning lit up the entire valley, and in that brief flash, Jessica saw him. Rex stood at the edge of a cliff, his body rigid, shaking, his ears pricked but his eyes were wide and wild, staring into the endless black below as if ready to throw himself into it just to escape a nightmare he thought would never end. Jessica froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs. But she knew. One wrong move, one rushed shout, and he'd be gone. She lowered the flashlight. She stood still, slowed her breathing. Then she spoke. Not as a commander, not as a soldier in the trenches, but as a friend. Her voice was quiet and steady, soft against the tearing wind. "Rex, it's me." Each word is deliberate, solid against the chaos. "You led me out of that war zone, remember? Now it's my turn to bring you home." For endless seconds, Rex didn't move. He stood there like a statue worn by time and weather. Then, slowly, his head tilted toward her. His ears drooped, unsure. His eyes flickered, as if some half-forgotten memory was trying to claw its way back. Jessica didn't wait. She took one slow step forward and raised her hand in front of her chest, palm open, the same signal she had used years ago in training, a promise of safety. And Rex stepped back. Just an inch, away from the cliff's edge. His body was still taut, but he was no longer trembling like before. Jessica closed the distance, knelt, and whispered comfort until she felt the cold press of his nose against her palm. The rain still hammered down, cold and punishing. But between them, something fragile had been rebuilt. Jessica ran her hand over his soaked head and felt the shiver in his wet fur ease under her touch. She knew then she had pulled him back from the edge, just like he had done for her, dragging her from bloodied trenches and smoke-filled skies. This time, it was her turn to lead them home. Two survivors. Once again, walking back together. As Jessica gently pulled Rex away from the cliff's edge, Her chest was still tight from the fear that had nearly paralyzed her. Yet warmth slowly returned with every steady beat of her heart, as if she had just dragged a familiar soul back from deep darkness where she had once been lost. The storm hadn't passed. The rain still lashed at her face like a whip, and the wind tugged violently at her soaked jacket. But Jessica no longer felt cold. She rested a hand on Rex's shoulder, palm pressed firmly against his tense muscles, which slowly began to relax beneath her touch. They stood there together for a few brief seconds, steadying their breath. Then, as Jessica turned to lead Rex home, a sound ripped through the curtain of rain and brought her to an immediate halt. It was a cry, weak, trembling, like a thin blade cutting through the chaotic noise of the storm. Jessica held her breath and whipped her head toward the sound. Not far away, among the eucalyptus trees swaying violently in the wind, she spotted a faint, blurry shape, a small pink jacket soaked in rain, and next to it, the tiny form of a child, curled up tightly, shivering so hard it seemed as if she might vanish at any second into the white curtain of rain. But what froze Jessica's blood was what she saw next. A pack of wild wolves, 4 of them, thick gray-black fur bristling, their eyes glowing red with hunger. They were closing in, forming a tight circle. Their claws crushed the rotting leaves below with sickening cracks, while the wind whipped through the trees like war horns blaring in the dark. The child no longer made a sound. Only muffled sobs stuck in her throat, her tiny hands clutching her knees in a last desperate attempt to shield herself from the death closing in. And Rex didn't run. He stood his ground in front of the child, his drenched body tense, his back straight, just as he had once stood against far greater threats on old battlefields. His soaked fur clung to his solid frame, muscles taut beneath the skin. His tail was low, set in a stance ready for combat, ears alert, his deep golden eyes lit with unwavering resolve. He growled, a steady rumbling sound, teeth bared in a snarl that carried no fear, only a calm, cold warning that struck straight into the predator's instincts. A warrior. His body was battered, but his spirit was unbroken. Jessica stood there, stunned by what she saw. Her emotions surged wildly. She had thought Rex had lost his protective instincts and had abandoned his will to fight and his faith in the world. But now, here he was, an immovable wall shielding a fragile life from merciless predators. His growls deepened, his chest vibrating with every warning, while the wolves crouched lower, narrowing their eyes, calculating. Their sharp teeth gleamed, ready to tear into any opening. Jessica didn't let herself freeze for another second. Instinct took over. Her survival training clicked into place. She drew her folding knife from her pocket, the only weapon she still carried since discharge, and without hesitation, she charged toward Rex. Her body dropped low to maintain balance on the slick, muddy ground. Her eyes scanned the terrain in sharp focus, just like the tactical drills from long ago. "Rex, hold!" she commanded, her voice rock steady, even as her heart pounded hard in her chest. It was more than an order. It was a promise, to Rex and to herself. One of the wolves lunged without warning, its body arching like a drawn bow unleashed with deadly power. Jessica reacted instantly. She hurled her knife, the blade burying deep into its thigh. The wolf let out a piercing cry, twisting and thrashing in the mud as blood seeped into the rain. The other wolves hesitated, pulling back just a step, reassessing. But Jessica knew it was only a brief delay. "Back to me, Rex!" she shouted. For the first time since bringing Rex home, he obeyed without hesitation. Growling, he moved in slow, measured steps, placing himself like a living shield between Jessica and the child. Jessica quickly scooped the little girl into her arms. The child was shaking uncontrollably, thin arms gripping Jessica's neck with desperate strength, clinging as if to the last straw. Rex stayed ahead of them, growling low through the storm, retreating step by step as Jessica moved them toward safer ground. Together, the three of them slowly backed away, Rex never breaking position until they slipped free of the wolves' circle and found the narrow path leading out of the woods. When they finally passed the last line of trees, Jessica exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The child still sobbed against her shoulder, but she wasn't shaking as violently anymore. Rex stopped. He turned his head for one last look back into the dark tangle of forest. His golden eyes remained fixed there, watchful, until Jessica rested her hand gently on his head, stroking softly between his ears. She felt him sigh beneath her touch. His whole body eased as if permitting himself to stand down. "You did good," Jessica murmured, her voice unsteady, but not from fear. "You're still the warrior I knew." Rex didn't answer with a look or a bark. He simply lowered his head, pressing lightly against her leg for a moment, then lifted it again, standing tall like a soldier not yet ready for full rest. The storm still raged in the distance, but between them, something had changed forever. Rex was no longer just a wounded, lost animal. He had fought. He had protected. He had come back to himself, and Jessica knew she had crossed a line too, a step closer to bringing them both home, together, just like the old days. The storm finally retreated by dawn the next day, leaving behind a sky smeared in dull gray and a landscape riddled with puddles and mud after a night of violent winds and rain. At the edge of town, inside the modest wooden house, pale light filtered through the dust-coated window slats and cast a faint glow over Rex. He lay curled just outside Jessica's bedroom door, his body still damp from the long night spent in the rain. But his breathing was deep, steady and strong, not the ragged, restless gasps of fear that had marked his first days back in the house. The night before, when Jessica had wrapped the little girl in a dry wool blanket, brought her home, and called the local police and rescue services, she hadn't taken her eyes off Rex for a second. She saw it then. The look in his eyes no longer held that permanent wariness. Something had softened, as if an invisible cord wound tight inside him for so long had finally begun to loosen. When the rescue workers carried the girl away, safe in their arms, Jessica had sat beside Rex on the front porch. It was where they'd spent so many silent afternoons together, but never as they did now, belonging, in that moment, not just to the same place but to each other. She didn't speak. She simply rested her hand near his paw, not touching but not pulling away either, letting Rex feel the closeness, letting him know the distance between them wasn't what it used to be. When Rex tilted his head slightly and let his nose graze the back of her hand, Jessica felt something inside herself, something cracked and raw, finally close. There would still be scars, but they no longer bled. That entire day, Rex stayed close to her. He followed her into the backyard, lay quietly at the bottom of the porch steps as she cleared broken branches and debris left by the storm, then trailed behind her when she checked the fence, part of which had been blown clean off its posts. His footsteps were light but sure, no longer the nervous movements of an animal desperate to escape, but the steady gait of a companion finding his place again. Jessica didn't say it out loud, but in her heart, she knew Rex was learning to trust again, and so was she. As the sun set, Jessica brought out an extra thick cushion and placed it directly beside her bed, beneath the small window that overlooked the empty yard. She didn't make a show of it. She smoothed the blanket's edges in silence, leaving it there like an open invitation she didn't need to voice. Rex stood a few steps away, watching with his calm, dark gaze. After a moment, he approached slowly, drawing a deep breath as if testing the air for safety, before lying down exactly where she'd prepared for him. There was no hesitation, no wary glances behind him. As if he'd decided this small space was the one place where he no longer had to fight. That night, Jessica didn't close the bedroom door like she used to. She left the soft golden light of the bedside lamp spilling into the hallway, casting a warm glow over Rex's curled form by the bed. When she lay down and rested her head on the pillow, She could hear his breathing, slow even, blending with the gentle breeze outside. No longer the erratic, shallow breaths of fear. And when she exhaled softly and closed her eyes, she heard a faint sound, a low, peaceful sigh from Rex, as if he was finally letting go after months of constant vigilance. In that quiet moment, Jessica felt it deep in her bones. Something had truly changed. No longer was this an uneasy truce between two survivors. It was something reborn, a trust that had once shattered, slowly knitting itself back together. When she stretched out her hand over the side of the bed, letting her fingers brush the coarse fur along his back, Rex didn't pull away. He shifted slightly, nudging his nose against her fingertips before settling down again. That night passed more peacefully than any other since Jessica had brought Rex home. No warning barks, no restless pacing in the dark. Only the steady breathing of two souls who had found each other again after losing everything. Jessica closed her eyes, feeling lighter than she had in years. She knew there was still a long road ahead, and there would be other storms. But in that moment, the healing had begun. One breath, one heartbeat, and one quiet night at a time. Right there, with Rex beneath her bed. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the eucalyptus branches outside the window, Jessica woke to a strange but welcome sensation. A night without nightmares. No sudden gasps for breath. No reflexive reach for the gun under her pillow. Just sleep. Deep, undisturbed sleep. Rex was still curled up at the foot of her bed. His thick fur rose and fell with each steady breath. When Jessica sat up, his ears perked, but he didn't startle like before. He simply lifted his head, his dark golden eyes searching hers for reassurance, before settling back down. This was something new, Jessica thought. And just as the realization settled in, the steady hum of an engine carried through the morning stillness, rolling in from the gravel road out front. A familiar rhythm,